I'm calling to order the House Elections, Finance, and Government Operations Committee. And is there anyone that would like to move the minutes? Representative Davis. Are there any corrections or discussion? All in favor of approving the minutes? Aye. Opposed? And they're approved. First on the agenda would be the Office of Legislative Auditor. And anyone testifying for the record, give your name and your position or affiliation. And you may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. For the record, my name is Judy Randall, Legislative Auditor. I want to thank you all for taking the time today to hear two reports from our office. The first one that we're going to discuss is regarding the Office of the Secretary of State, and then the second one is a 2018 report that we did on voter registration. But we'll start with the Office of the Secretary of State performance audit that we released in November of 2023. And I love presenting this report because there was, I think, just one finding, and that's awesome, right? We love when we have pretty clean reports to present. We love when things are working well. So thank you for hearing the report. And to get into the details of the Office of the Secretary of State performance audit, I'd like to turn it now to Director Bonfeld. Thank you.
Please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. For the record, my name is Jordan Bionfold. I'm an audit director with the Office of the Legislative Auditor, and today I'll be providing a presentation of our performance audit of the Office of the Secretary of State, which we released in November of 2023. And we conducted this audit as a part of our regular cycle of audits of the constitutional officers, which we perform once every 4 years. And we did receive the full cooperation of the office during the course of this audit. And so the Secretary of State is one of 4 constitutional offices in Minnesota. Its main functions are to assist in election administration, administer the Safe at Home program to provide a confidential address for those who fear for their safety, to provide customer service and filing services for various businesses in Minnesota, and then they also provide some administration and other activities. Our audit objectives were to determine if the office had adequate internal controls, complied with significant legal requirements, and resolved prior audit findings. The audit scope of our audit was January 1st of 2020 through December 31st of 2022. And this is what we call a full scope audit, where we look at all financial activity during this time period, which includes receipts, payroll expenditures, and non-payroll expenditures. And so the office does receive a general fund appropriation to fund most of its operations. They do also receive some federal grants. And so during our audit period, they received about $57 million in appropriations and $17 million in federal grants. The office does also collect various fees. During our audit period, they collected about $78 million in fees. And a large chunk of these fees do get deposited into the general fund. So that was about $63 million was deposited in the general fund. And then state law does authorize the Secretary of State to retain some of those fees to offset the cost of providing those services. During our audit period, payroll was the largest expenditure category at about $26 million. Other non-payroll expenditures was $25 million. These include reimbursements for administering the presidential primary election. These include professional and technical contracts and other purchased goods or services. And so in general, this was a very positive audit. Our overall conclusion was that the office generally complied with legal requirements and generally had adequate internal controls. We found no issues in our testing of receipts and payroll expenditures, and we noted that the office did resolve all four of the the findings from the prior audit issued in 2017. We did identify one written finding related to the office's grants monitoring. And before I get into the finding, I'll give a brief overview of the grants activity at the office. So they do have both state-funded grants and federally funded grants. The state-funded grants are to purchase or lease authorized voting equipment and then implement absentee ballot drop boxes. The federal grants came from the CARES Act to respond to COVID-19. These were for purchasing, for example, sanitary or disinfecting supplies for election officials and in-person voters. And then the office also provides grants under the Help America Vote Act, or HAVA, to improve security, election security improvements. During our audit period, the office made payments on 313 grants totaling a little over $11 million. Most of these payments were advance payments that were issued after the grant contract was signed, but before the grantee incurred any of the expenses. All of the grantees were political subdivisions, such as counties, cities, or towns. And then finally, state law does require monitoring after the distribution of these grants. In our finding, we found that the office did not always monitor the grants and did not always comply with state law in monitoring the grants. And so you can find the audit, or the finding in page 23 of the audit report. We sampled a total of 41 grants, and we found that in 15 of these grants, the grantee did not provide the detailed invoices or receipts. And without these detailed receipts, the office could not determine whether the grantee spent this money in accordance with the contract for eligible expenses and returned any unspent funds. Two contributing factors that we identified was, number one, the office did not have documented policies and procedures for monitoring grants. As a constitutional office, they are not required to follow the Department of Administration Office of Grants Management policies. And during this time period, they did not follow those policies, and they did not have their own documented policies. And then we also found some inconsistent requirements for the grantees. So I'll give you an example. We saw in some grant contracts, the language in the contract stated that grantees must provide detailed invoices upon request. And then they were also required to provide financial reports, and we found in those financial reports, they were actually certifying that they did provide documentation of all invoices and supporting receipts or other supporting documentation. For the 15 that we identified in the finding, we found that those grantees did not actually provide that detailed support to the office, and the office did not request that detail from the grantee. The finding resulted in 3 recommendations. First, we recommended the office establish a grants monitoring policy and procedure, and we recommended the office should revise its grant contract and financial report formats to clarify the requirements for providing invoices and receipts. And finally, the office should review the detailed support for all grants, such as invoices and receipts. And that concludes my presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Well, thank you very much. And we do have several new members, as in, freshmen. And it's always good for the public to hear. But one nice thing about what we just heard, you hear a lot of bad things coming out that are found by the auditor. And this is a pretty good report. And so just remember that there are good things that come out of that, and usually you only get news media coverage on the ones that are more problematic. Are there any questions from members? Representative McDonald?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Let's have Representative Freiberg go first, if you don't mind.
I don't have to.
Representative Freiberg.
Okay, sure, thanks. Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm glad to hear you acknowledge that it's a positive report, because I agree with that assessment. I mean, I guess I was just a little befuddled because they mentioned they only made one finding, and it's about the monitoring of the grant requirements. But I mean, in my mind, there's lots of other findings, it does suggest this is a well-run agency. They tested and found no issues in the payment accuracy and eligibility of expenses for a random sample of 40 reimbursement payments. There was no issues in the $2.1 million across 8 professional services contracts. The OLA analyzed 269 payments for leases and parking totaling 1.3 million, found no issues. Tested a sample of 2,209 payments totaling 9.3 million for other state contracts and found no issues. Reviewed the inventories of 682 assets totaling 4.6 million and again found no issues. But I mean, you read the conclusion, the report summary, if all you saw was the report summary and that there's one finding listed and that finding relates to inadequate monitoring of grants, I guess I'm just curious how the OLA decides what kind of the top line for a report is. To me, the summary kind of makes it sound like there are more issues than there are because they only list one kind of negative finding when clear, if you read the whole report, it's clear they analyzed lots of other things and found it very well run.
Thank you, Representative Freiberg. Finding is not plural, so it is pretty evident that it's just one, but would you like to reply?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair and Representative Freiberg. Thanks for the question. We follow auditing standards on these reports, the reports that are put out by the Financial Audit Division and these performance audits, and that is those are the standards. I agree, it has it only focuses on problems, and it doesn't talk about all the good things. And, I'm certainly happy to talk to our Financial Audit Division about ways to maybe adjust that, but the model for our reports is based on Yellow Book standards.
Thank you. Was there, okay. Representative McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm not sure who this question or who can answer this, but in regards to provisional balloting, I always found that to be problematic in so much of the fact that after the election is called for the candidate, a provisional ballot that was probably spoiled or incorrect has already been
Representative McDonald, this one is more of a financial audit in those policies. You might have some enlightenment come from the other audit that will be reported on later. So if we could hold that question for then, and I'm sure you'll get some enlightenment. I did when I first heard this one presented to committee a few years ago.
Mr. Chair?
Yes, Mr. McDonald.
As I was saying before I was rudely interrupted, no, I hear you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate it. I will then refrain from my question, and if by the grace of God, I'll have time to ask it later on in this committee. So thank you, Representative Cuomo.
Well, thank you, Representative, and I will keep your name prominently on the list. Representative Lee.
Thank you, Chair. So this question is for the OLA. Just going back to the standards you were referring to, I'm a new member on this committee. I'm not on, the group that also works with the OLA, and so I want to just say that at the onset that I want to learn. And in this report from November 2023, you talk about how you use the same standards that the Government Accountability Office uses when you do your analysis. But I wanted to maybe better understand what you meant when you used the Yellow Book and kind of the guidelines that you use when publishing the findings. I worked in Congress for 10 years, so I've relied on GAO reports a lot. This is a resource that members on both sides of the aisle use, and it is considered the gold standard for auditing. And I just note, like, GAO reports that are like reissued, right? So they typically go back and do analyses of processes and agencies like 5-10 years later, and they will typically say, you know, our old report is no longer current, right? And like present updates. And so I know this report before us today is from 2023. I think there was a report from 2017 that also did a performance review of the Secretary of State. And so I think I would also add on to Lee Freiberg's comments that it would have been helpful to see the progression of your findings in 2017 and then how that might have changed, good or bad, in this finding in 2023. And I don't know what that yellow book you're referring to does, but I'm just kind of curious how that compares to what the GAO does, because they do say, hey, like 10 years ago, we did a report on this issue, and this is where things have changed. So just want to offer that.
Thank you, Representative Lee. I thought I heard in the presentation that you gave the number of findings in that previous one, and I believe you said that all of those findings had been covered. If you've got maybe a little bit more detail for Representative Lee, but you know, go ahead when you're ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Representative Lee. Thank you for those comments. And while Mr. Bjornfeld is looking for those comments, I can just respond more generally. So thank you. I think that's helpful. And we have been getting feedback about being more explicit about prior findings when we're going back to an agency and presenting those kind of upfront in terms of whether they have been addressed or if they still remain. And some of our even more recent reports since 23 have started to do that. So I hear what you're saying. I think it's a great idea, and I think we're going to try and work on that. Regarding what the reports GAO does, so the Office of the Legislative Auditor has basically 3 different types of reports, kind of 4, that we put out. So one is, you know, we conduct an audit of the state's financial statements, and that is really an opinion on the statements. So there's not much of a report there. That's more a letter. The second kind is what you're seeing here today with the Office of the Secretary of State. That's an internal control and compliance report. While it follows GAO standards, as I said in response to Representative Freiberg, those do focus more, for better or worse, on kind of whether or not there are issues. The Program Evaluation Division focuses on programs and processes and systems and opportunities for improvement. And those reports, I think, have a little bit more of that a balance of things that have been working well and things where there are opportunities for improvement. And then we have special reviews that are focused narrowly on specific concerns, and those also kind of have more of a balanced set of findings and then recommendations where needed. So we have different types of reports similar to GAO, and we do kind of look to them. I agree, they're the gold standard, and we follow that for some of our reports more closely than others. And the yellow book and the green book for the internal controls and compliance are the standards that we use here, and those are put out by, well, Green Book is put out by GAO.
Thank you, and just for the members, we had an auditor that was around for a few decades, and then I believe, was it 3 years ago? 3 years ago, Ms. Randall took over as the auditor, and there's been some transition in, you know, how we're tracking some of these things. And I think if you look at, I think it's House File 3, there's the idea of having a report of all of the recommendations, how many have been completed partially or still open, and it also covers some of the legislative things. And there's an example report that was presented, and I think maybe that would be something that you would find very useful to look at, and we can maybe get that to you. The auditor indicates that she'll be able to get you a copy of that. I think that might clarify some of your issues. Representative Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I guess I wasn't going to speak to this, but Representative Freiberg, your comments kind of stunned me. This isn't a that boy report. That's not what the Office of Legislative Auditor exists for. We're in government. We need to hold our government to the highest standards of efficiency. I mean, Office of Legislative Auditor. It is their job to find out where there's problems in government. An audit is to verify the accuracy of financial statements. I'm reading this report. Over 1/3 of the grantees did not include invoices or receipts with their submitted financial report. This is very concerning to me. Over 1/3. That's part of an audit. We should be encouraging them and congratulating them for this report to let us know, because the Secretary of State's office should definitely be accountable in this committee right here. It's also their job to detect for errors, non-compliance, operational efficiency, and I think they're doing a very good job. If anyone deserves the that a boy, it's this office right here. And I don't care if you have an R or a D by your name for these elected positions. We need to hold them accountable for what they're not doing right. I'm looking forward to working with this committee to hold the Secretary of State's office accountable for making it even better. Thank you.
Representative Lee, you had a follow-up question.
Yes, I guess it may not be relevant now. I was just going to say it's not. I didn't want to mischaracterize some of the comments earlier that the progress of the 2017 audits, that I didn't want that to be mischaracterized, that wasn't included in the 2023 report. They definitely were. I think the concern is, if you're just looking at the summary, which a lot of people do because as legislators, there's limited time. And even when the public looks at this, right, because you put out press releases, they're probably just going to look at the executive summary. And so that was my question, just not to imply that you hadn't reviewed this. So I just wanted to make that clear. And I also do want to congratulate you on being promoted from deputy auditor to full auditor now. Definitely see that progression and appreciate the institutional knowledge, right, of how this has changed in the OLA office. So thank you.
Thank you, Representative Lee. And I think Representative Altendorf, I think you had a question.
Yeah, it's just a quick one. So thank you, Chair. Basically, with this audit, then if this was, a procedural audit, then how often does that happen is basically my question. And if there is a problem, what then is, the mechanism or the system that you have in place to weigh that and make sure that that doesn't happen again or to judge it again?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Representative Altendorf. Thank you for the question. So OLA is the auditor of the constitutional offices, and we are auditing each of them on a 4-year rotation. Secretary of State now won't be up until 2027 again. And honestly, that is the most frequent touch on any program or agency that we have in the state. It's a pretty quick return to an entity. But we do the same for the governor's office, for the attorney general's office, and for the state auditor.
Thank you.
And thank you. And Chair, and just my last question was, when there is some sort of problem, something detected or something they can improve on, is there a follow-up mechanism to that? That's it.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chair, Representative Altendorf. Sorry I didn't get to that last question. It's the same as it is with all of our reports. We don't have enforcement or anything like that. We provide the information to the entity, so to the Secretary of State's office, and then to the legislature. And then that information is really, up to the legislature to use it how you want. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Representative Roche.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Do you guys have a list of the all of the grantees, and specifically the 15 that didn't have the receipts or invoices? Can we get a list of that by chance?
Mr. Chair and members, I do not have that list offhand, but we do have that list, and we can provide that information to the committee.
And members, these reports, when they're coming out, you can, of course, get a copy, but you can also schedule a briefing to get some more detailed information. And the general thing that the auditor does is look over the systems. But I do believe in more problematic audits, if there is a discovery of, fraud in that, there's a process for getting that passed on to the appropriate entities to have that further investigated and then have actions taken. But doing the audit and what they present is fairly more of an upper level. And a lot of the details, you can get some of those with an interview with them. But some of those details also, there's privacy and some restrictions for what can be said, especially in a public testimony. But again, if you've got offline some clarification required, I think that would be appropriate. And if you would want to continue with the next audit report, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. So before I dive into presenting this report, I would like to give some caveats and just be really transparent about what I can talk about and what I can't talk about. So this is a report that we released in 2018 on voter registration. We have not done work in this area since probably 2019. The team that worked on this evaluation, none of them are still at OLA. So you got me talking about it. And of course, I was involved back then, but not, I wasn't in the nuts and bolts of it. Also, the law has changed related to voter registration since we released this report. So I've already primed the Secretary of State's office. I have primed Mr. Gehring. I would like to ask any of you who have more current and deep knowledge than I do about the current laws to chime in. So that all being said, I do think that there's some helpful information here about just how the voter registration system works. And so that's what I'm hoping to do today, but I will not be offended at all if anybody wants to do a timeout and help me provide more accurate information, especially as related to how things have changed. So I just want to be really clear about that. Thank you. Okay, so let's dive in. So voter registration in Minnesota is a shared responsibility between the county and the state. And both state and county officials work hard to ensure that Minnesota has a well-functioning voter registration system. And for the most part, we do, but it's not perfect. And I think it's important for us all to recognize that. Our report highlights a lot of the challenges that state and county officials face to maintain a fully up-to-date, accurate list of people who are eligible to vote. The thing about the voter registration list, on election day, is that is a point in time of who is eligible at the point that list was created, which I think when we did it back in 2018 was printed. I'm not even sure if that's still how it is, but it's a static list at that point. But people's lives change, right? People die, people turn 18, people are convicted of a felony, people are released from prison. So the voter registration system has to keep up with all of those changes because those are the things that determine a voter's eligibility. So at any point in time, including on Election Day, there will be some inaccuracies on the list that determines who is eligible to vote. Now, when we conducted this evaluation in 2018, and I'm sure it would be true again today, everybody we spoke with, everybody shared the desire to make sure that eligible people can vote and ineligible people, are not allowed to vote. But in an imperfect system, different people have different comfort levels of where we fall on that spectrum. I want to be really clear that we did not come to an opinion or state any opinion about where we should be in terms of, if you have a system that really emphasizes open access, even inadvertently, it might mean that some people who are ineligible to vote are able to do so. On the other hand, if you really focus on the restrictions and tightening up on that side, it might mean inadvertently that some people who are eligible to vote are not able to do so. So again, where we land on that is up to you, and thank you for making those decisions. But we did not weigh in on that. So let's talk about what we did find, but let's see, it's not showing up. Let's see if that will. All right, hold on, I'm going to try one more thing just to see if we can get it to work. And if not, you all have the slide deck in front of you? Okay. So let's just see if we can get it to go.
Members, we do have copies of the slides in the back, if there are any issues. And part of the reason why these two audit reports was so that we're going to be discussing later in the meeting what are the priorities and some of the issues. I thought this gives us some good background and might help us in that discussion, because this committee is going to come up with, fixes or tweaks, technical corrections, and then, more substantive bills that will be before us. And we need to understand where everybody's coming from to work better as a team. And I see that the presentation's working. Please proceed, Ms. Randall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That was good stalling. Thanks, I appreciate it. Okay, so the key facts and findings that we had in this 2018 report, depending on when and how a person registers to vote, the information they provide will receive a different level of scrutiny. Voter records, as I've said, may be inaccurate on Election Day. We did confirm that there were some people who were ineligible to vote who registered and voted. And we also confirmed that there are barriers to registration, despite the good work by lots of folks to help folks get registered. So let's dive into those a little bit. First of all, the statutory requirements for voter eligibility. So to be eligible to vote in Minnesota, you have to be at least 18 years old, you have to be a U.S. citizen, and you have to have lived in Minnesota for at least 20 days. Things that make you ineligible, and this is something that has changed since we did the report in 2018. When we did the report, it was serving a felony sentence made you ineligible. Now it's folks who are incarcerated for a felony sentence. So that is something that I do know has changed since we did the report. Other factors that can make somebody ineligible: if an individual is under guardianship and their right to vote has been removed by a court. And then also if an individual has been declared by a court to be legally incompetent. Okay, so let me walk through the steps for registration. First, I'm going to start by walking through the steps that are involved for somebody who registers to vote before Election Day. And the timing of registration is really important here on the process. So somebody who wants to register to vote prior to Election Day, the first thing they do is they complete an application and provide the information listed here: their name, address, date of birth, and an ID number. And that could be the last 4 digits of a social security number, it could be a driver's license number, it could be a state ID number. They sign the application, which includes an oath certifying that they are eligible, and they present that information to a county election official. The county election official then enters that information into the statewide voter registration system, SVRS. You're going to hear me say that, SVRS, a lot. And depending on if it's somebody who's registering for the first time, the county official creates a new record. If it's somebody who has registered before and they're updating their record, they update the record. Okay. Now we enter into a lot of data sharing. So SVRS, remember, statewide voter registration system. So on the left is the application action. This information then goes into the statewide voter registration system. And then overnight, that data system compares information with other systems associated with that ID number. If the information is immediately verified, the person will be identified as verified in SVRS, and they're eligible to vote. Done. There might be some discrepancies, though, in the sources of data that come back from that overnight data match. It might be, for example, that the way the person entered their name is they used a nickname or they didn't use a nickname, and that matched up in different ways with other data sources. So then the county election official has to say, okay, are we talking about the same person? Are these two different people? And so there might be some county official judgment that has to go in to determine if they are verified to be eligible or not. Again, if the county official determines they're eligible, then they're marked as verified. Some people will not be verified, and those people will be so-called challenged on the voter roster as unverifiable, or depending on how they register, there might be a note that they have to present an ID or something on election day. After all of this happens, another form of verification happens where the county sends out what's called a postal verification card. This is a postcard that gets mailed to the address put into the system, and it is not forwardable. So if it gets returned back to the county, that indicates that there's something amiss, right? It doesn't mean the person's not eligible, but it means somehow that information is not matching up. So now the county election official has to do something to figure out what's going on. Is it that the county staff transpose numbers? That sometimes happens. Is there something else that maybe would indicate that the person isn't eligible or had moved or whatever? And so then again, that would be challenged. If it's a transposition of numbers or something like that, they send a new postal verification card, et cetera, and then confirm residency. So that's kind of the general system up front. And then over time, SVRS gets updated with other information. Over time, they compare it to other data sources, and other things happen in somebody's life, right? Like there's a change in address, or the state court administrator's office reports on felony convictions or on discharges. So this is, this kind of very dynamic, fluid information that is kind of flowing through SVRS at different points in time. And so the roster and the data are getting changed and updated throughout. When some of this information is received by SVRS, so for example, if somebody's convicted of a felony or if there's a death record, things like that, the county officials will challenge that voter's record. And that just means there's a question about eligibility. Doesn't mean they're not eligible, it just means that they're gonna need some more information on election day. So now we get to the I voted sticker. So if the person is eligible on the roster, they show up on election day, they sign the roster, which includes an oath, and they vote. Great. Okay, the process is different, however, for people who show up and register on election day. So the first line here is kind of what we just walked through. The second line is what happens, for people who register on election day. So the beginning is the same. They have the same application. They provide the same information. They sign the oath certifying that they're eligible. And then they provide proof of residence to the election judge. And in Minnesota, there are several different forms of proof that somebody can present to show to prove their residence. They show, and if you want to see that, I don't know if you have the report in front of you, but page 44 does show kind of those different proofs of residence. I think 72% of the people, when we did this report, used their driver's license or state ID to demonstrate their residence. Once the election judge accepts their proof of residence and, the registration form is completed, they vote. The database verification that I talked about with that, this SVRS shooting out to all the different data sources and the postcard verification process, that all happens after Election Day. So that's the big difference here. So as we've discussed already, the information that's on the roster affects people's access to vote. If the information on the roster is incorrect, so it got challenged by the county official, or if you're not on the roster, then you have to register on Election Day. If somebody has a challenge on the roster, they go through a different process, and we called that oath for challenged voters. And basically, the head election judge asks them certain questions. They solemnly swear and provide their answers. And if they answer in a way that demonstrates that they are eligible, they are permitted to vote. And again, it goes through that database check after voting has happened. So we looked at Election Day registrants for the 2016 election. Again, I know that really, when I saw this slide, it really emphasized to me kind of the age of the report. But so for 2016 Election Day registrants, most of them were either updating their registration or registering for the first time. And you can see that some of them were reactivated. And this really shows that Election Day registration really does increase access. But of course, because of that sequence of verification, it also does raise some integrity concerns. When we looked at the challenged voter records in 2017, so what we did is we took a snapshot of the roster and looked at who was challenged, how many people were challenged, and the reasons why. And of the 3.3 million people who would have been printed on the roster in that 2017 snapshot, not quite 31,000 were challenged, so not quite 1%. Now, one thing I would say that has really changed, well, that likely has changed since the law change, is the line related to felony. And I guess I'll just spend a moment talking about that to help explain the impact of the law change. It used to be that if you were convicted of a felony, but on probation still, you were not eligible to vote. And that is no longer the case. As long as you're not incarcerated, you are eligible to vote. So I would expect that felony, that 7,800 number that you see there, to not really happen as much anymore, because either they're incarcerated and they can't show up on Election Day, or they're out and it doesn't matter if they're on probation or not, and they would be eligible to vote. So I do think that law would have an impact on that were we to do it again. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about why the voters' information may be inaccurate. There's a lot of reasons, and this gets back to the fact that the information is changing kind of constantly, and we have people involved in the process. And so sometimes the voters listing on the roster is inaccurate just because of county practices, a typo. I think that's really one of the main things. There's also a big timeliness issue, and that gets into data quality as well. But some of the data aren't, they're not updated right away. And again, depending on when a county kind of sets its roster for Election Day may affect when the information was updated. So for example, the state courts administrator's office, when do they provide the information about discharges, right, from felony convictions or felony convictions? When does that information get updated, and then does it hit the county at a time when they still have time to incorporate it into their final roster before Election Day? So the timing issues really are an underlying factor on the quality of the data. Now, we did look at those felony challenges in particular back in 2018. Again, I don't think this is as relevant now, but we would just point out that in some cases, there were challenges due to felony conviction that we thought shouldn't have been on the voter's record, and that there were some folks who didn't have a challenge who should have. And again, we think that was really due to the timing issue. While that issue in particular is no longer relevant, I think the recommendation still stands about the Secretary of State developing a report to identify inactive and challenged voters who register on Election Day so that there can be additional follow-up by counties afterwards. And my understanding from the Secretary of State's office is that they have in fact implemented that or developed that report and encouraged counties to use it. I know they're here if you want to hear from them, but my understanding is they have implemented that recommendation. And I'm seeing some nodding, so I think that's correct. We also looked at investigations that the county attorney's offices conducted of ineligible persons who had registered or who were alleged to have registered or voted. We looked at reports that were submitted from January of 2016 through September of 2017. So these were investigation reports that county attorneys did looking into these ineligible folks. And from the reports they submitted, there were 69 cases of people in that almost 2-year span of people registering or voting while they were ineligible. We did find some issues with the reports. We don't think it included all the investigations, and it didn't include detailed information. So for example, a report might say, we investigated 25 people and we ended up charging 1 person. But there wasn't more information than that, so we don't have a lot more to provide to you. But just know that the county attorneys are doing investigations on some of those, and most of them turn out to, they don't follow through or don't do charging for most of them. Of those cases, of course, they have to determine whether there was intent, so whether somebody knew they were ineligible and voted anyways, and so that's a high bar for the county attorney. Okay, I'm going to switch gears kind of abruptly, it seems like, and talk about barriers to registration, and now looking at the access side of voting. So the law requires agencies to provide voter registration services to employees and the public. And so we surveyed all the cabinet level agencies to determine the extent to which they were providing those services. And in response, we learned that 14 of the 23 cabinet level state agencies did. The other 9 provided that service only to employees. And what we heard from the agencies was that there was some confusion about whether they needed to provide those services to the public as well as to employees. And I think depending on which agency it was, it didn't make as much sense maybe for them to be doing public-facing voter registration services. And so we had a recommendation that the legislature clarify kind of what they wanted the state agencies to do. I do believe that since that time, there is a new law that requires registration from DPS related to driver's license applications, and then also at the Department of Human Services. I believe that there are now more requirements for kind of automatic voter registration, but that's an area where I'd love to phone a friend if we have questions about it. We also talked to community action agencies to reach out to them to learn about how they are helping or how they work with folks to help register folks to vote. And they identified a number of barriers that they felt were making it difficult for people to register. Some of it was just having people simply understand the registration requirements, some disinterest among folks, and then these other issues, a lack of transportation, language barriers, literacy barriers, and then not having proof of their ID or residence. I know I went kind of fast. That is the end of the formal presentation. I will do my best on questions and hope others can help. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Randall. I was wondering if some of the people from the Secretary of State's office would like to join at the testifying table. Maybe give a little bit of a recap progressing from that audit to where we're at now, and then the members can ask questions. But part of what you're gaining here is seeing the last audit, so to speak, of the registration system and where things were. The SOS personnel are going to give us a little synopsis of where we progressed. And then we as a committee will look at how do we need to progress farther, clarifying, tweaking, correcting issues. I mean, that's where I'm thinking this might be useful to us. So please identify yourself and for the record and give us your sort of bridge to today.
Thank you, Chair Quam, members of the committee. My name is Paul Linnell, and I'm the Elections Director with the Office of the Secretary of State.
And I'm Julie Strother, Deputy Secretary of State. Paul Linnell is clearly the expert here, but I was involved in the audit in 2018, so can answer questions related to that.
So if it's helpful, maybe I can just kind of walk down the list of recommendations from the report and highlight some of the updates that have taken place since then. Julie, feel free to jump in if I'm leaving anything out here. But from the list of the 6 key recommendations, I think the first was that the Office of the Secretary of State should improve the online voter registration application. And I think in our response letter to that, we noted that I think there were a few specific items about verification screens for the registrant to be able to confirm that the information that they entered was accurate. So giving them a pause to re-review that information, get at some of these ideas of data, whether it be handwritten applications, but also specifically with the online registration at the point of registration to make sure it's accurate, they're not typing too quickly. So that was something that we implemented shortly after the report came out to expand what that verification step would look like before the online registration is actually submitted. The second recommendation was that the Office of the Secretary of State should begin to modernize the statewide voter registration system. As was noted in the report, and I think in our response letter, while the system is strong and mighty, it is showing its age and is I think doing a lot more now than it was initially designed to do, including I think in some key areas, adding in the ability of the system to track and manage absentee balloting, which I think really has exploded in the last, certainly over the last decade. So we've seen the use of those functions really expand within the current SVRS that's being used by the counties and the state. And so we've taken a number of steps to begin modernization of the system, including outreach to the counties and beginning to kind of construct what a modernization process might look like. It's been a period of time we haven't got into the sort of heavy lifting of moving that modernization forward with a number of other priorities, but we have, I think at the end of last year and this year really start to lay a timeline for what modernization's next steps will include, being able to staff our office in a way that will allow us to take on this heavy lifting work and actually look at sort of an SVRS 2.0 that can continue to handle all of the expanded functionality that the system is being taxed with. I think the point to emphasize here, though, is that while the system right now is is older and has its limitations, it's still a secure system, one that meets all of its requirements laid out in law. But I think we know at the state level and certainly our county end users, there are things that we can do both to upgrade the technology, but also make it run more efficiently and help to address some of the things that were identified through this report. Recommendation number 3, I think, is more for the committee and the legislature around amending Minnesota Statutes 2017-201.121 subdivision 3A to remove the random sampling requirement or clarify its purpose. I will say that after the audit was issued, I know while I was at the county level at that time, there were enhanced reminders to county election officials that this really is, as the law is currently written, a random sampling of Election Day registrations to ensure that to the extent that It is random, the order in which those Election Day registrations are processed and entered by the county should be done. And we continue to advise and remind folks of that. I think it's a 10-day deadline post-election to have those 3% of Election Day registrations processed and entered. Recommendation number 4 was that county election officials should consider using the voters' updated due to voting report to identify persons who may have voted while ineligible. This report is one of the reports that's accessible by state and county election officials through SVRS, and is one that's in our sort of standard checklist of post-election procedures for county election officials to follow when they're doing their data entry. So it's something that each election, they're reminded about running this report, and I think there's an explicit reference to the OLA audit as this being a report that should be run to help to identify those potentially ineligible voters who may have voted. The 5th recommendation was that the Office of the Secretary of State should consult with counties about the need for a report to identify inactive voters who register while ineligible to do so. And I think that was shortly after the report was the OLA audit came out that we began work on that report. It was essentially a modification to an existing report to allow for inactive voters to be included when running that report. So that functionality, as Ms. Randall indicated, is in place and has been in place. And then finally, the 6th recommendation was that the legislature should amend Minnesota Statutes 2017-201.162 to clarify its expectations of state agencies to provide voter registration services to members of the public. And I may defer to Julie on this one as far as the steps that have been taken, but I know there's a lot more clarity around that work since the audit was issued.
Mr. Chair, Julie Strother, Office of the Secretary of State. The statute hasn't changed besides automatic voter registration, but there has been significant work with our outreach team to work with agency leads to make sure that voter registration is being offered to both the public and employees throughout the enterprise. And so I don't think formally a lot has changed in the statute regarding clarification, but there has been significant work done with our voter outreach team and state agencies.
And I believe that's through the high-level list of recommendations, but certainly open to any follow-up or questions or anything else that you wish for our office to expand upon.
Well, thank you very much, and I hopefully that's helped and assisted members to understand sort of the progression, and also help you to think of ways that we can continue to improve our system. A couple of things I noted when they said a judge removing under guardianship because the Constitution takes precedent over state law. What was put into law was allowing a judge to grant back the right to vote, and that came up in a previous hearing. There were this was presented in committee, and there was another sampling audit that was done afterwards, because during committee, a certain person brought up that in 2016, there were over 16,000 bad registrations on the HAVA-required SSI site, which is publicly accessible. You can go there and you can check out for any week how many were submitted for verification and how many turned up bad, and details of, so many people were actually deceased and et cetera. And so it wasn't evident in this audit at all, because no one shared with them that the HAVA-required site that was utilized to verify Minnesota registrations, or a portion of the Minnesota registrations, had over 16,000 bad ones. So the numbers, when they were presenting, didn't add up. In 2018, that election cycle, it was over 15,000 bad registrations. So there was a sampling audit that was performed later on in 2018, which I believe was presented in 2019 and was referred to. And that one discovered a few things, but one of the things that was somewhat surprising, there were 4 convictions from people who were registered at a P.O. box store. And that was notable if you were in the legislature back then, because that's the same location that had several hundred that were registered that were voting in a primary for, I believe it was a Minneapolis district. The old systems you're complaining about, one advantage is that they're old enough to where you don't have hackers familiar on hacking them. But I'm trying to, okay. The other thing that came up after that audit was that in the sampling, they found several counties were not cleaning off the challenged ineligible voters, and that those same voters did register. And hopefully the Secretary of State's office has improved that system. But we work on the Minnesota voting, but we got to remember that the federal laws we have to maintain compliancy with and compatibility with. So I think that was the rest of the story that I was going to include from that. And I do see that I recall Representative McDonald had a question that was good now. Representative McDonald.
Mr. Chair, thank you. No, in the time that transpired, I have a different question, actually. The question for the SOS, not to the auditor, because that's an old audit, but the governor signed into law last biennium law, a new voting law that would allow a person to just describe their residence, down by the river next to the oak tree. I'm just wondering, is there any data as to how many voters that were eligible because of the description of where they resided?
Mr. Allen?
Representative McDonald, Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. I would not have any data in front of us. I think it's something we could look at, identifying the number of records in the system that would not have more of a physical address description associated with them. I will note we have had records with a physical address description in the system previously. It's part of the federal voter registration application does have the ability for a voter to register who's unhoused or doesn't have a physical address to provide that description. So this law change brought Minnesota's state voter registration application sort of in line with that. But whether that led to any meaningful increase, we'd have to go and check and get the numbers for you.
Representative McDonald.
Sure, thank you. I think I'd be interested in that. I think, would anybody else be interested in that kind of data to see how that worked in the last, with the new election laws? And then lastly, Secretary of State's for questions for you regarding provisional ballots. I haven't seen the data yet, but do we know in the last election or even the previous election, how many provisional ballots after the vote was cast and the candidate won from mayor to governor, do we know how many provisional ballots that were ineligible and disqualified?
Representative McDonald, I believe that Minnesota is one of 3 states that was given an exemption and is not compliant with HAVA requiring provisional ballots. So a nod of your head that, no, yeah. So there wouldn't be any data on that because Minnesota doesn't have that for our citizens.
Very good, thanks, Mr. Chair. I did see that in the report.
Representative Lee, I thought I had you down if you had a question.
Yes, well, question from the last discussion, but applicable here. I think something that I just would like to share with folks is that really like the OLA is, when it does its job and issues reports like this, I think we should refrain from passing judgment on whether they're like good or bad. It's just helpful when you're thinking about an enterprise to say, hey, like this is what's going on. It's a good status report. And as we've seen with this report from 2018 and the 2023 report, what's helpful is it's kind of like a progress report for agencies to show, oh, like this is where you can improve. And like our representatives from the Secretary of State's office has shown, like, you can go point by point on the changes we've made. And it's also helpful because, as we've talked about today, the legislature has made a number of statutory changes to resolve some discrepancies or ambiguity in policies and in the law. So I would just offer that. But a question on, I guess, the topic at hand. I think in this report, and I was trying to find it, as well as the report you were talking about earlier with cross-checking with the Social Security Administration's data set. I think this is probably a better question for the OLA. I just wanted to better understand from the 2018 report and also just the use of this data set, if you could tell us what it means to be unverified, because I think my understanding is often you can be unverified in the Social Security system's database because it's just incredibly not flexible because it is so old. But as we learned from the presentation earlier, you can be verified through your state ID, which may be more relevant. And so I'm just wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about that, because as I understand it, if your name is Mary Ann and there's a space in one spelling and not a space in the other, you could be unverified. So it doesn't mean that you're ineligible to vote or ineligible to be registered. It's just a problem with the data set.
Ms. Randall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Representative Lee. Absolutely, I would agree with what you said, which is, and I'm pretty sure that I said it earlier too, that if you're, that unverified just means we need more information on you, right? When you show up to vote, it doesn't mean that you're not eligible. It just means that for some reason, when we did the data match, things didn't exactly match up. And you're exactly right that the system is very persnickety. And so I remember looking through SVRS and looking at some voter registration information and seeing that there were some individuals who had to kind of go through the registration process numerous times, like 4 or 5 times, because like it would be like, okay, Judy Randall, you know, and then it would come back like, nope, no match. And it was like, oh, okay, Judith Randall, no match. Okay, Judith L. Randall. And that was part of why we had the recommendation to add that screen, or, you know, why Secretary of State added that screen for online verification so that it would show it back to me when I was registering and be like, oh, shoot, I have an extra space there. Because if I had submitted it like that, it would have pinged back as unverifiable. I'm still eligible to vote. I just didn't type in my name exactly the way the Social Security Administration had it, or something like that.
Representative Altendorf.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks for joining us again today. And I just wanted to go a little bit more over the voter list. I know we kind of talked about it a little bit a couple days ago, but so my understanding is the Secretary of State that this has been given over to the counties. The job to clean the voter rolls is the counties, if that's correct. And then do you see like a wide discrepancy of some counties are doing it well, some are not? And finally, then what is the Secretary of State doing to help improve that if counties are struggling?
Mr. Allen.
Representative Altendorf, Chair Quam, thank you for the question. You know, I think there are a number of factors as to why, you know, data entry or processing might be performing where it needs to be and where it might drop off. I think one of the things that we mentioned in our overview presentation was related to the high rates of turnover. And when you have a transition in an office and just maintaining staffing levels and the knowledge base of the work that needs to be done, particularly during key periods, you may see challenges or issues with keeping up with deadlines and getting that data entry done, running all of those reports, in addition to sort of the multiple hats that those county auditors need to wear if they have other, you know, legally required deadlines and functions that they're tasked with. But on the whole, I think that the 87 county auditors across the state do an excellent job of keeping up with data entry and processing and keeping up with all of the incoming and outgoing new registrations, updates to their registration, and we do, you know, regular tracking and monitoring of that. I think to your question from Monday about tracking the county entry of voting history, we maintain a publicly accessible page that tracks county progress of entering that voting history post-election, and do regular follow-up with those counties if they are, you know, at a percentage that might suggest they've got a ways to go. Are you struggling with anything? Is there anything we can do to provide information, training resources that might help with getting through that. So, our office remains available as a resource to assist the counties with all of those statutorily required responsibilities.
Representative Altendorf.
Thank you for that. And maybe I'm just a type A person, but I'm a systems person. And if there's a real discrepancy happening at the county level, and we're seeing different counties some doing a really great job, some not doing a really great job, Secretary of State really is the oversight that needs to be making sure that this is uniform. And I'm just wondering, is there ever any thought that's given to pulling this more into the Secretary of State's responsibility instead of pushing this out on the counties, so that you do have more control over the process and you are reassured that the voter rolls? So for example, have you compared yourself to other states? Is other states doing it similarly, or is there better ways to do this whole process to make sure that it's more accurate?
Representative Altendorf, Chair Quam, thank you for the question. I don't know that our office has any official position to look at modifying the requirements that are currently in statute for counties to be, have those responsibilities related to registration. As far as comparisons with other states, there's a wide range of ways in which states do manage voter registration, including states where there's no requirement for a statewide voter registration system at all. It's entirely still at the county level to maintain and update that information. I think you get some benefits certainly to having a statewide voter registration system as far as the data sharing and being able to all be on the same system. Everyone has the same tools that they're using. It provides for easier training. I think some of the one of the things we mentioned on Monday about the electronic registration information center that about half of the states are a part of, that really benefits our state to have that data, allowing for updates coming in and out of the state for voters that have moved in and out. But I think the counties may have questions or concerns about any change as big as that to suggest that the state be responsible for the entry of voter registration applications. That has been a county responsibility.
Is it Representative Greenman had a question?
I do. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just following up on that, because, and I think you're getting to it, would love to hear a little bit more about how participating in ERIC, sort of how that works, because I think to Representative Altendorf's point, it's sort of helpful to hear how we're getting and some of the challenges of both getting data as across states, but also how participation in that is helping update our voter rolls.
Representative Greenman, Chair Quam, thank you for the question. Yeah, I think it is one of the useful tools that we have for those other participating member states to basically run comparisons of our voter registration and driver's license information that helps us identify when someone may have moved to another state. So, you may take for granted that when you up and leave Minnesota, move to another state for whatever reason, hopefully you'd stay here. But if that takes place, there's not sort of an automatic trigger that someone at the state is telling you, you need to do all these things before you head out. We use the data that's available to us, including the USPS change of address information. So if you fill that out and say you're moving next door to Wisconsin, that will trigger an information update in the system. But if there's, if that's not done, there's not a whole lot of information that we get unless when you go to register to vote in your new state, if you fill out that voter registration form, it will usually have spaces for you to put in where you were previously registered. All states are required to provide that. But with ERIC, there's more of an automated way of screening those lists and helping to flag, hey, these folks have moved to another state. So when we get that data, then we're able to send postcards to the address that the person was registered at in Minnesota, triggering a 21-day period, after which, if they haven't responded to that card to say, oh, actually, I'm only temporarily away, I do still live in Minnesota. If they don't respond to that card within that 21-day window, then their record is inactivated. So that's a big tool that we have to help ensure that our voter rolls stay accurate and up to date among the others.
I did want some clarification. So you're still sending postcards out to all of those new registrants?
Chair Quam, correct, yeah. So anytime a person registers to vote, be it before or on election day, the sort of standard postal verification card is sent to the residence of the registrant, and that triggers the process. You know, if the cards are returned, that's still unchanged from what was laid out in the OLA report.
And the total number in the last elections, the 2024 election cycle, the total number of postcards that have been sent out?
Chair Quam, we will have that data for you shortly. I believe the end of the month is when the report is due, so we'll have that to all members. The counties, I think, have a deadline of this week to submit their data to us that we then compile into a single report to be submitted to the legislature.
How about 2022? In a ballpark is fine.
We'll take a look and, Chair Quam, we'll take a look and see if we can get that data before this hearing is over.
Well, yeah, and if it's offline too, with that, the breakdown of how many went past the 21 days, how many were returned as no valid address and that type of thing, so we can understand that and have it as we're talking about ways to improve the system. Representative Vernig.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have kind of a multi-part question, and also I am new. I only served half of the last biennium on elections, so some things may have happened that I'm not aware of. I'm a super nerd. I love IT modernization stuff. I will say, though, driving a manual is way cooler than an automatic. It's harder to steal, so sometimes I get the value of older technology. The question I have is, would you still need, so on page 36, it says that, and I understand that this is old, right? So 1.4 million and nothing ever gets cheaper. Do you still need that $1.4 million, or has there been a request for, since 2018 for IT modernization? Has funding been allocated for that? Is it enough? Is the HAVA match important to modernizing your systems, especially as it relates to cybersecurity? Obviously, 2018 to today is very different. So if you could talk a little bit about that, I appreciate it.
Mr. Chair, Julie Strother, Representative, since this report was put out, the HAVA funds were authorized at the federal level, and one of the purposes we can use it for is modernizing SVRS. So in our spending plan, we've identified SVRS modernization as part of that. In addition, I think it was mentioned earlier this week, a large portion of those funds are for cybersecurity and security. And so the requests that we have for the match are mostly related to security, but would also tie into our ongoing SVRS modernization efforts.
A follow-up, Rep. Vernig? Rep. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is for the Secretary of State's office. What are the basic requirements for registering to vote?
Go ahead.
Representative Davis, Chair Quam, I think in one of the slides that the OLA had up there, it probably outlines those basic requirements with the exception about the felon eligibility piece, and that if you're not currently incarcerated for a felony offense, that you would be eligible to register to vote. The other piece that I don't think was covered there was related to pre-registration. So if you are 16 or 17 years old, you may register to vote. Of course, you would be not an active voter record until the time that you turn 18.
Rep. Davis, follow-up?
Yeah, you can give a description of where you live, and you got to provide 4 digits. I'll just cut to the chase here. You do know that you can use a driver's license or a social security number to register to vote, correct?
Representative Davis, Chair Quam, yes, that's correct.
Okay.
Representative Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can non-citizens get a driver's license in Minnesota right now?
Rep. Davis, yes, that's true. It's not any different. There's no distinction, color, rotation, or anything on that. And if you want to get into that discussion, we can, but I think we may get in a broader discussion. And I think we that discussion, we don't have enough time now because we'd also want to look at the issues that have come up with the AVR and some of that
Mr. Chair, if
data.
I could continue my line of questioning, I just want to make sure the Secretary of State's office, which I'm sure they do, I just want to make sure that they know that a non-citizen can get a driver's license.
If you would respond to that general topic, and then
Representative Davis, Chair Kwame, yes, my understanding is that the driver's license application process, you can apply for a standard Minnesota driver's license without presenting documentation of citizenship.
Yeah, and thank you.
Representative Davis.
Mr. Chair, and I am going somewhere with my line of questioning here because I do want to get out a very important point with this committee here. Are you aware that non-citizens can get a social security number?
Representative Davis, Chair Kwame, yes, my understanding is that's correct.
Okay. And
Ms. Randall, is it I always thought it was a identification number for taxes if you're working in the U.S. as a non-citizen, and it was distinguishably different than a social security. Is that something that you're aware of, or we can maybe get some verification on that delta? But because I think you answered Rep. Davis.
yeah, so if I may, Mr. Chair,
Go ahead.
continue. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So non-citizens can get a social security number through work authorization, of course, and certain humanitarian projects. But so here's my question. I want to know, how can the Secretary of State's office guarantee, because it is state law, that you have to be a citizen to vote in Minnesota? How can the Secretary of State's office guarantee that if they can get a social security number, they can get a driver's license, that they are not voting or registering to vote in our elections?
Mr. Allen.
Representative Davis, Chair Kwame. So regardless of the manner in which one registers to vote, the very first question on the voter registration application that they're signing off to is answering the question, are you a U.S. citizen? And then in every certification statement that's signed at the bottom of the voter registration statement, voter registration application is an attestation to include the eligibility criteria, among which is that they are a U.S. citizen. Also acknowledging penalties under perjury if one were to lie or falsify that voter registration application, with that same information then being presented again at the time of voting, so at the polling place roster that includes that information. So it's the attestation that every voter must complete when they're signing up to register to vote or cast their ballot, that they are in fact an eligible voter.
If you can also clarify, is that they come in and they say that and they vote, that ballot is commingled right then and there before there's any process to verify? Is that a correct statement?
Chair Kwame, that would be correct. If someone were to certify that they are eligible to vote and if they're registering on Election Day, providing documentation that indicates their proof of residence and that they've completed all of the requirements. If subsequently their information is investigated, turned over for investigation, and they're found to have not been an eligible voter, their ballot would have been cast in that election, but they'd be referred to for the appropriate charges if they were found to not be eligible to vote.
Now, you said certify. Your definition of certify is, hey, I raised my hand and I swear that I can vote. Is that what you're calling certify?
Chair Kwame, yes, so that's the process, both at registration and at the time of voting, that every voter is completing that oath or certification statement.
Okay, so you're basically saying that anyone can go anywhere in the state and say, I certify that I live over here and that I'm a citizen and I can vote. And that vote gets cast, counted, commingled, so there's no way to pull that out. So if later on it's determined that there was a not legal to vote person voting, there's no way to correct the polls.
Chair Quam, if an ineligible voter were to cast a ballot, that ballot is as part of maintaining the secrecy of the ballot. It's separated from a voter's record. There's nothing that ties that particular ballot to a voter's information once it's cast. So it's really the penalties of voting while ineligible that serve to deter that from taking place.
Well, that statement may cover here, but 96% of places where 96% of the people that live in the United States, that isn't true there. Because if they don't have correct documentation, they don't have the verification and et cetera, they are granted a ballot. They're not denied a ballot, they're granted a ballot, but it's a provisional ballot. So then there's verification done before that gets commingled. So I want members and also the people, citizens and people watching, that when we get into the debate, that's what it's about. Because you are, if it's obeying federal election law, like the vast majority of the people in the United States, you are guaranteed a ballot. But that ballot, if you don't have the appropriate information, does not get counted until you come back in and you're given a period of time to come back in with the documentation to prove it, and then it gets counted. And that, I think, is a key difference that we have in our state than others, especially when we have statewide elections determined by 300 and some odd votes. And that, I wish we had gotten into the discussion. I was hoping to give everybody 2 or 3 minutes to say what was their top topic or two, and we could all share that, but this testimony has stretched on, and I think there's some good learning from this, because when you see different viewpoints, you have a better shot of catching things. But I believe, is it okay if I go to Representative Coulter?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is not the original question I wanted to ask, but I was hoping Mr. Gehring could clarify, because a claim was made that I think maybe we need some better factual representation of, because my understanding was that non-citizens could not get Social Security numbers, that the numbers that non-citizens receive would be, and I don't know what it stands for, but ITIN numbers. Am I correct in that understanding?
Mr. Gehring.
Mr. Chair, Representative Coulter, I actually don't know the specifics of federal law on Social Security numbers. I could look into it and get back to you.
I think it would be helpful for us to get some
Coulter,
clarification.
that's what I was saying, and I was agreeing with you, that there's an ID number you can get to use for taxes, and the Social Security Administration is aware of that, but it's not a Social Security number, of which I think I got a card with mine on when I was very young and before I could vote.
I do have a different question that I wanted to
Representative
ask.
Coulter then.
But thank you. I'm wondering, so I am looking at a news report recently about 17 employees of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, I think is what we sort of call it, that we heard about at our last meeting, who have been placed on some form of leave. And I'm wondering if folks from the Secretary of State's office, given obviously the importance of cybersecurity threats, if you could just speak to how you're responding to that, and what further concerns that we may need to address as a legislature arise from that possibility, or event, I should say.
Mr. Chair, Representative Julie Strother, I will say we are working to gather information on what that means. We've been told that some of The folks that we have worked with fairly closely over the past few years have been put on administrative leave, but we don't know what that means yet. We also don't know right now what the future of the services we receive from CISA will be. We are working to gather information on that. I will say they have been a very important resource for us. There's a dollar amount associated with the free services we get, but there's sort of an unquantifiable expertise that we get from them too at the federal level. And so I know as of this morning, the Secretary Simon was reaching out to the national associations, trying to gather information about what exactly being on leave means. Are they coming back? And we just don't know at this point. But we certainly do rely on those services, and I know a lot of other states do, to help ensure the protection of our election system and our local partners.
So are there federal verification sites and, software and sites that are no longer available to you?
Mr. Chair, our understanding is the services that we are getting from them are still continuing. But the first indication we saw about, they had regional elections representatives that were specific with CISA to work with the election communities. Those folks have been put on leave. And we don't know what that means. And I know there's still some discussions about, I think I've been reading this from news reports. We're trying to gather actual information, but the future of CISA as an agency and what the scope of their work will be. And so Secretary Simon, I know, is tracking this very carefully, and I think would be happy to talk to the committee about what changes at the federal level might mean for us here at the state. But the resources that CISA has provided have been critical, particularly on the cybersecurity and protecting our election system. So we're watching anxiously with what's happening out there.
So have you had people make calls and not being able to get a hold of people?
Mr. Chair, no, that is not the case. But if we were to make a call to our elections reps, we wouldn't get a returned phone call. We're reaching out to essentially the civil servant head now of CISA to try to gather information about if we had questions that would have otherwise gone to those election reps, where would those questions go? And so I will say it's a very fluid situation right now. Most of what we know is what we've seen in the news.
So to be clear, you haven't lost access to online or software available resources. You haven't had an instance that anyone here is aware of someone trying to call to contact somebody and hasn't been able to get through. Because I know that we don't know how many people are working in that office, nor do we know that what kind of program they've got, because people take vacations and therefore they have backup and et cetera. So if you end up getting detailed that here are the things that aren't working, we haven't gotten a call back, or if we've called and it's taken 3 hours or 3 days, it'd be good for us to know, and please pass that on to the committee, because I've seen a lot of things in the news that, vary from being accurate to not accurate. And so I'm trusting you for actual real data. Did you have a follow-up, Representative Coulter? No, I'm done. Thank you. Representative Roach.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate you, some more kind of going back to the comment you made, how we have races that are really close by a couple hundred votes, but it gets even closer than that. We've got races in the state where they were as close as 14 votes, with missing ballots. So I just hope that this committee takes that serious when we looking to move some bills here forward at a later date with election integrity and the importance of how provisional ballots can play a key role on that. So just a comment. Thanks.
Thank you, Representative Roach. And I was referring just to statewide. I know that there have been races. We have a serving member that in one of the races, that representative won by a vote. And I've known of multiple instances of where you didn't have to use all your fingers to count up the difference between in a House race. But when you do statewide and millions of people are voting, a few hundred's a very, very small percentage. I don't see any other, oh, Representative McDonald.
Well, thank you. What time are we done, Chair?
I believe it's 2:45.
Okay. Mr. Chair, Representative Roach just brought up something about a recent election with 14 ballots. The candidate won, Representative Tapke. But then there was 20 ballots that were in a recount that were disposed of, is what the news said. So I still haven't got any answers or wrapped my, just some questions answered. How could 20 ballots just be thrown away? And then Secretary of State's office, what is the repercussions of that particular happenings where 20 ballots were just disposed of?
Representative McDonald?
I want the Secretary of State answer, Mr.
No,
Chairman.
I understand, and I will ask them for a response, but I've had conversations with the Secretary of State, and this is not the first time that I was like 02 or 06, there were like a couple dozen ballots that were taken home and burned in a fireplace, and that race was decided by 6 or 7 votes. So it'd be nice to look at the history and what have been done. That's more important than, I like the auditor, but these are the things that have an issue with voter confidence. And so, please give an answer, but I do want maybe a more detailed coverage from the Secretary of State at a later time. So go ahead.
Representative McDonald, Chair Quam, I think, we touched on this briefly on Monday in this specific case. I think as a starting point, both, the county and our office identified what happened with ballots not being counted is unacceptable. That should never take place. The statutes and I think the procedures are fairly clear that have steps along the way for both absentee ballots and ballots at the polling place to be balanced, that the number of voters and the number of votes are always tied out. And when those steps are not followed, or if other steps are missed, that's where you could find yourself in a situation where I think, as outlined in the court order from the election contest in 54A, that goes into some detail of the specifics that happened in that case. And I know our office has been reaching out to counties and looking at ways in which we can further strengthen the laws to make it abundantly clear the steps that should be taking place and are taking place across the state that ensure that the counts are accurate and that every valid vote that's cast by a voter is counted as it should be.
And the reason why I referenced back to some, back in the past, because hopefully in, a couple decades, we've got some clarification of what exactly happened. So when you don't come back with a fuller amount of information, some of those historic things, like those that were burned, but also when the Coleman-Franken recount happened, there were multiple precincts that had more votes cast than voters that cast votes. And if you can blow the dust off and see what things were done, so that might help us do some clarifying language to assist election people, whether county, precinct, et cetera, to more easily understand the law and the procedures and not accidentally do something that causes a stir. And I believe that Representative Freiberg has some comments.
I was just going to, thank you, Mr. Chair. I was just going to say we're getting a little far afield from the item printed on the agenda, which is the OLA report on voter registration. So just thought I should mention that if we are going to discuss this in the future, it would be nice to have some opportunity to prepare and have relevant people in the room related to the situation.
Thank you, Representative Freitag. And that's why I was Did I, Freiberg? I apologize that.
Dankeschön.
And that's why I was hinting at, and a more robust response, but including other instances so that we have a historic perspective and can look at doing that. And that was part of the reason why I wanted to give us a half hour of each member would talk for a few minutes about what issues they were really excited about or think that we need to address, and we'd get to know what each person's, this is what I'm focused on, because we have individual differences, and we have individual skills, strengths, and weaknesses, but together we can make a team that should be able to globally cover the issues. And I'm Representative Freiberg.
Thank you, Chair Quam. I sense that members are getting kind of ready to go here, and I did want to ask if you had a sense for what the agenda for next week would be like, if we, may see the discussion of member priorities reappear on the schedule next week, or what you had in mind.
Thank you. And I actually worked with an engineer whose last name was Freitag, and so that's why I messed that up. But
It means Friday in German. So Freiburg means free mountain. Just a little trivia there.
He did like golfing on Fridays, but no. Part of the reason why we're doing this is because we didn't have, when we did the scheduling and agenda plan, we didn't have bills to this committee. Now we're getting bills to the committee, and so my plan, and it should be coming out soon, is that we'd be hearing a few bills on Monday, and I think you might have one of those that we're planning on hearing, and we're going to try and do some ones that are maybe a little less controversial, but can get us, working together and discussing the bill. So Representative Freiberg.
I'm desperately trying to think of a pun on your last name, Mr. Chair, and nothing is coming to me except, I think one I've used before, like, whether or not I have any qualms about the agenda for next week.
Or if we're in a quandary.
But thank you, and I don't know if it's a finalized list, but I believe your CA helpfully contacted my soon-to-be CA as well, or I'm not sure what the title is at this weird stage in this power sharing agreement, but, and so I have a sense for what those bills are. I noticed one of one of them is a member bill dealing with local government issues. I've had some questions from members on my side about the jurisdiction of this committee. I know we didn't have a government operations committee last session. Now this is the Elections, Finance, and Government Operations Committee. I'm just wondering if you could kind of clarify where the jurisdiction between this committee and the State Government Finance Committee, which you and I also serve on, lies. I'm particularly interested in like local government issues and what sorts of bills that didn't come to the Elections Committee last session might be coming to this committee this session.
Well, the arm wrestling is still going on, and I think that's a work in progress. I see it as back in, I think it was 2020, when we went remote, and it was Macy, I think might have been I'm spacing the chair's name, but we covered such things as Rochester came in and they had a bill that they wanted to increase and copy what Minneapolis is doing with redevelopment of existing homelands and in areas and different structures and regulations. So I see that as being with us, the things that are local government trying to do things, which interacts with their citizens or other local entities. Of course, nothing that is, straight dollars, but more of the process, procedure type approach. But again, it's a developing, we're recreating that, and together we can make it better, right?
Will there be tickets available to the arm wrestling match? Because I think a lot of us would like to see that.
I don't know if it's pay-per-view or not, but, yeah, as soon as I have clarity, I will assist you in having clarity.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
And I think with that, unless somebody's got some silly humor to get me with, we're adjourned.